You are an apprentice chemist in a Whitechapel pharmacy in October 1878, and Metropolitan Police Inspector Malcolm Cruz arrives in 72 hours to cross-reference your laudanum sales ledgers against coroner death certificates for children under age 2. What the Pharmacy Act enforcement calls mandatory inspection, and what your mentor Thomas Aldridge calls the moment when 11 months of perfectly legal sales become evidence for negligent dispensing, when the brass measuring spoon you used to dispense Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup turns out to measure the interval between a crying infant and a dead one with fire. Not because selling laudanum to desperate mothers was illegal. Because documenting each sale with enough precision to track inventory makes the pattern visible. When inspectors compare your ledger addresses to coroner lists and discover they match with uncomfortable frequency. Here's what 72 hours actually cost, when 3 years of apprenticeship measuring opiate tinctures with brass instruments and leather-bound record-keeping becomes exhibits in an inspection that has already shuttered 4 Bethnal Green pharmacies for what you call fulfilling prescriptions, and what the Metropolitan Police call negligent dispensing of controlled substances to vulnerable populations. If sleep stories built on impossible choices help you drift off, hit subscribe, and we'll keep building them. The notice is pinned to the pharmacy door at eye level, still wet with morning fog. The Metropolitan Police seal bears yesterday's date, and your keys are already in your hand. Your fingers go cold around the brass key ring. The paper is official weight, heavy stock that doesn't curl in damp air. Inspector Malcolm Cruz, Metropolitan Police Pharmaceutical Enforcement Division, will conduct mandatory inspection Thursday morning, October 20th, 1878, at 9 o'clock precisely. All narcotic sales records must be available for cross-reference against coroner death certificates. Failure to comply constitutes obstruction under Pharmacy Act 1868, Section 17. 4 Bethnal Green pharmacies closed this month for negligent dispensing. The notice lists their addresses. You recognize 2 of them. 72 hours, 3 days, Thursday dawn to Thursday dawn. The street behind you is still dark, gaslight halos blurred in October mist. Whitechapel before sunrise smells like coal smoke and horse dung, and the particular sweetness of the brewery 2 streets over. Your breath makes small clouds. The pharmacy door is solid mahogany, with brass fittings that Thomas Aldridge polishes every Saturday, and the notice is pinned directly through the wood, driven with enough force that the nail head sits flush with the paper. You unlock the door and step inside. The interior is exactly as you left it 12 hours ago. Amber bottles arranged alphabetically on mahogany shelves behind the counter. Labels facing forward. Pharmaceutical Latin in your careful handwriting. The leather sales ledger sits closed on the counter, its binding worn smooth, where palms rest during transcription. The brass measuring spoon in its velvet case. The mortar and pestle, marble worn concave from 3 decades of grinding. Everything positioned for another day of documented transactions. You light the gaslight. The flame catches, steadies, fills the shop with warm yellow light that turns the amber bottles into honey-colored promises. The notice in your hand lists cross-reference against coroner death certificates for children under age 2. You have been working in this pharmacy for 3 years and 4 months. You measure laudanum tincture into amber bottles 6 days a week. Quarter grain accuracy. Customer name, address, quantity, date. Your initials confirming the transaction occurred exactly as documented. Professional competence measured by penmanship and precision, and the ability to maintain records that satisfy legal requirements, without acknowledging what those records actually document. Every Thursday for 11 months, Dr. Edmund Hartley has delivered his coroner list. Deaths in Postal District E1, infants under age 2, addresses. Causes where known. Thomas Aldridge matches those addresses against your sales records, with mechanical focus, notation marks in pencil that he erases before you return the ledger to the counter. You have watched him do this 37 times. The pattern is consistent, the addresses repeat. The quantities in your ledger increase at intervals that suggest medical adjustment, rather than the mathematical progression they actually represent. You set the police notice on the counter beside the closed ledger. The shop opens in 34 minutes. Thomas Aldridge has not yet arrived. He is never late. In 3 years you have opened the shop alone exactly twice, both times because he sent word the previous afternoon about illness requiring rest. No word came yesterday. The gaslight flickers. Shadow moves across the amber bottles, turns their honey glow briefly dark. You rest your hand on the leather ledger. The binding is warm from gaslight, smooth under your palm, where the grain has been worn flat, by precisely this gesture repeated daily, for however many years the ledger has been in use. The pages inside contain your handwriting and Aldridge's, customer names and addresses recorded with pharmaceutical precision, quantities measured to quarter-grain accuracy, 3 years of documented transactions that constitute either legitimate medical practice or systematic negligent dispensing depending on which truth Inspector Malcolm Cruz decides matches his paperwork. 72 hours to decide whether the ledgers you help maintain for £3 a month are worth protecting. The street outside is beginning to lighten. Grey dawn, October cold, the sound of cartwheels on cobblestones 2 streets over. Whitechapel waking up to another day of documented commerce. You open the ledger to September. The leather ledger binding feels smooth under your palms, where 3 years of daily transcription have worn the grain flat, and you open to September 9th, finding Thomas Aldridge's handwriting documenting 8 ounces of laudanum tincture, sold to Sarah Pritchard, 14 Dorset Street, infant teething remedy. The entry sits in permanent ink with the pharmaceutical precision you were trained to maintain. Customer name and address recorded as required by the 1868 Pharmacy Act. Quantity measured to quarter-grain accuracy. Concentration noted in grains per fluid ounce. Price calculated at 3p per ounce. Date and your initials confirming the transaction occurred exactly as documented. The penmanship is flawless. Aldridge's hand does not shake in official records. You remember this transaction. September 9th was a Monday. Sarah Pritchard came in just after opening. Her infant wrapped in grey wool that had been washed so many times the fabric showed through in patches. The child made no sound. Mrs. Pritchard requested the usual remedy, spoke the infant's weight without being asked, £12 at 4 months, which even you recognized as concerning, and paid in copper coins counted twice. You measured 8 ounces while Aldridge recorded the transaction. The brass measuring spoon clicked against the amber bottle neck. The child remained silent throughout. You turn forward, through September. September 16th, Sarah Pritchard, 14 Dorset Street, 10 ounces. September 23rd, 12 ounces. September 30th, 12 ounces. October 7th, 14 ounces. October 14th, 16 ounces. The same handwriting. The same address appearing at weekly intervals. The quantities increasing in increments that suggest medical adjustment, rather than the mathematical progression they actually represent. The Pharmacy Act requires you to record customer addresses with precision sufficient for legal purposes but insufficient to prevent you from selling them the product that will make their address appear on a coroner's list. The penmanship standards are very specific. You flip backward to August. The Pritchard entries begin August 5th with 4 ounces. 4 months of weekly increases, documented with pharmaceutical precision. Each transaction legal under current statute, provided you can demonstrate the customer requested the product and you measured the dose accurately. Which you did, every time. Quarter grain accuracy. Your hands do not shake when measuring laudanum tincture. The gaslight makes the ink look darker than it is, creates shadows in the loops of Aldridge's handwriting that suggest depth the page does not possess. You turn to July, June, May. Other addresses. Other patterns. Margaret Finch, 8 Thrall Street, appears 17 times between March and September, with quantities ranging from 6 ounces to 20 ounces. The final entry is September 2nd. You do not remember seeing her after that date. The ledger contains 143 pages of transactions. 3 years of documented sales. Every customer name, every address, every quantity recorded as required by law in permanent ink, with pharmaceutical precision. The pages are numbered. The binding is intact. The records demonstrate professional competence and systematic record-keeping that would satisfy any inspector whose job was to verify that pharmacists maintain proper documentation. Inspector Malcolm Cruz's job is to cross-reference your documentation against coroner death certificates. You close the ledger and rest both palms flat on the leather cover. The binding is still warm from your hands. The gaslight flickers, steadies. Outside, the street is lighter now, grey dawn giving way to morning proper. You can hear voices, distant, cartwheels closer. 37 Thursday coroner lists. 11 months of addresses. Dr. Hartley delivers them in a leather portfolio, stays exactly 4 minutes, declines tea. Aldridge opens the portfolio, reads the list, makes his pencil notations, returns the papers. The portfolio closes with a brass clasp that clicks. Dr. Hartley leaves. Aldridge erases his notations before you return the ledger to the counter. You have never asked what he marks. You have never opened a Thursday portfolio when Aldridge is not present. The system operates with pharmaceutical precision, and you are a component of that system, trained to measure doses and transcribe transactions and maintain the appearance of legitimate medical practice. The appearance is very good, the penmanship is flawless, the labels are legible, the amber bottles are arranged alphabetically. The shop opens in 18 minutes, and Thomas Aldridge has not arrived. Thomas Aldridge enters through the back door 20 minutes after opening, his coat collar turned up against October rain, his face carrying the expression of a man who has already performed calculations you are just beginning. You are at the counter with the ledger open to September. 2 customers have already come and gone. Mrs. Fletcher for camphor liniment, Mr. Davies for digestive powders. Both transactions routine. Both recorded in your handwriting while Aldridge was absent. The police notice sits beside the ledger where you left it at dawn. Rain streaks the front window. The gaslight is steady. Aldridge removes his coat with movements that suggest he has rehearsed this entrance. Hangs it on the brass hook behind the counter with precision that does not extend to his hands. Walks to the counter without greeting, without removing his hat, without acknowledging that he is 23 minutes late for the first time in 3 years. His eyes move to the September 9th entry and remain there for exactly 4 seconds. Then to the police notice, reading the inspection date. The list of shuttered Bethnal Green pharmacies. The clause about cross-referencing against coroner death certificates. Then back to the ledger. His right hand moves to his vest pocket and withdraws the brass pen case he has carried for 15 years. You recognize it by the dent near the clasp, the worn engraving of his initials. He opens the case, removes the pen, sets it on the counter beside the ledger without uncapping it. The rain against the window is steady, not heavy. The sound fills the silence where greeting should be. You've read it, Aldridge says, not a question. At dawn, it was pinned to the door. Thursday morning, 9 o'clock. His voice is level, professional, the same tone he uses when instructing you on proper measurement technique. 72 hours from now, Inspector Cruz has closed 4 pharmacies in Bethnal Green this month, using the same cross-reference method. Yes. He looks at the September 9th entry again. 8 ounces Sarah Pritchard, 14 Dorset Street, infant teething remedy. Your initials confirming the transaction. His handwriting documenting the quantity. Except the quantity does not say 8 ounces anymore. You lean closer, the number has been altered. Not recently. The ink is the same color as the rest of the entry. Fully dry, no bleeding. But the 8 has been changed to a 4, carefully, the loop of the 4 following the curve of the original 8, the cross-stroke added with precision that almost disguises the alteration. Almost. When did you change this? Your voice comes out quieter than intended. Yesterday afternoon. Aldridge picks up the pen, turns it in his fingers without uncapping it. After I received word about the inspection, before I fully considered what changing it would mean. You scan the rest of September. September 16th, the 10 has become 6. September 23rd, 12 reduced to 8. Every Pritchard entry altered. Quantities reduced by half. The changes made with enough care that someone reading quickly might not notice, but someone comparing records would certainly detect. The coroner list, you say. September 18th. Infant female, 14 Dorset Street, cause uncertain, likely respiratory failure complicated by malnutrition. Aldridge recites this without consulting any paper. Sarah Pritchard's infant. I received that list on Thursday, September 20th. 2 days after the death. 11 days after I sold Sarah Pritchard 8 ounces of laudanum tincture for an infant who weighed, according to her own statement, 12 pounds. The rain continues. The gaslight makes small sounds, the flame adjusting to air currents. The altered quantities won't match the payments, you say. 4 ounces at 3p per ounce is 12p. The payment column still shows 24p. Aldridge's hand stops turning the pen. He looks at the payment column. His face does not change expression, but something in his posture shifts. A settling that suggests a weight accepted. No, he says quietly, they won't match. He sets the pen down, caps it without having uncapped it, returns it to the brass case with movements that are slower than necessary, as though the case is heavier than it was. Inspector Malcolm Cruz, Aldridge says, reading from the notice, has been conducting pharmaceutical inspections for 17 years. He has closed 63 pharmacies in London postal districts. 4 this month alone. He does not accept bribes, because his career advancement depends on maintaining closure quotas under the new enforcement system implemented after the Bethnal Green laudanum scandal. You know him. I know his reputation, which is the same as knowing him. Aldridge pushes the ledger toward you slightly, not closing it, just moving it 6 inches across the counter. He will arrive with coroner death certificates. 62 children, the notice says. He will request our sales ledger. He will compare addresses. Where they match, he will compare quantities and dates. Where quantities appear excessive for the age and weight of the child, assuming that information is available from family statements, he will note discrepancies. Where quantities were altered after the fact, he will note tampering. And then he will determine whether the pattern suggests negligent dispensing under Pharmacy Act Section 15, which carries penalties including license revocation and potential criminal charges, or whether it suggests standard medical practice complicated by parental misuse, which carries no penalty provided our records demonstrate reasonable care. The brass measuring spoon sits in its velvet case beside the mortar and pestle. You have used that spoon 6 times already this morning. Quarter grain accuracy. The spoon does not lie. The measurements are correct. The transactions are documented. The documentation is what makes them evidence. The payments won't match the altered quantities, you say again. No. Aldridge looks at you directly for the first time since entering. They won't. Which means the alterations are now evidence of tampering rather than errors in transcription. Which means I have spent the last 16 hours making our situation considerably worse while trying to make it better. He closes the ledger. The sound is soft, leather on mahogany, final. 72 hours, he says. I need you to continue normal operations, measure accurately, record precisely. Maintain the appearance of legitimate pharmaceutical practice. Can you do that? Yes. Good. He takes the police notice, folds it once, places it in his vest pocket beside the pen case. When Inspector Cruz arrives Thursday morning, we will provide him with whatever records he requests. We will answer his questions accurately. We will cooperate fully with his investigation. And the altered entries. Aldridge's hand rests on the closed ledger. His fingers are steady now, no tremor, the shaking from yesterday afternoon apparently resolved or suppressed. We will see, he says, whether honesty is measured by what we document or what we admit. The rain continues against the window. The shop is warm with gaslight, amber bottles glowing on their shelves, everything positioned for another day of professional competence and systematic record-keeping. 72 hours until the records become evidence. You open the ledger to today's date and pick up your pen. Aldridge carries the ledger to the back room without announcing where he's going. You follow, because you've learnt that silence means the decision has already been made, and what follows is implementation. The stock inventory records sit in wooden filing cabinets along the east wall, each drawer labeled by quarter and year. He pulls September without hesitation. Both books open on the work table under the single gaslight, the leather-bound sales ledger on the left, the inventory record on the right. His finger traces down the September pages in the sales record, while his left hand holds his place in the inventory sheet. Cross-referencing. The methodical precision of an audit. He locates the September 9th entry. Sarah Pritchard, 47 Osborne Street. 8 ounces laudanum tincture. His pen hovers 1/4 inch above the number 8. The nib trembles. Not the tremor of age or illness, the tremor of someone performing surgery on themselves. The ink touches paper. The stroke changes 8 to 4. The ink bleeds immediately into the fiber, spreading beyond the intended line, turning the alteration visible, even to an untrained eye. He blots it with the corner of his sleeve. The number now reads 4 with a shadow, where 8 used to live. You watch him stare at what he's done. The alteration creates a 4-ounce discrepancy between the ledger and the stock records. Which means the inventory must also be adjusted. Which means the wholesale purchase orders must be recalculated. Which means the entire chain of documentation requires revision to support the single changed number. He opens the inventory record to September bottle counts. His pen moves to the monthly depletion column. 48 ounces dispensed becomes 44 ounces dispensed. The number changes, the arithmetic adjusts, the paper now claims a reality that did not occur. The wholesale receipt, he says, not to you, to himself. He pulls the third drawer, the purchase orders from Hodgson & Sons, wholesale chemists, Aldersgate Street. September delivery, 6 gross bottles, standard 2-ounce laudanum tincture, pharmaceutical grade. The order placed August 28th, delivered September 3rd. Signed for by Thomas Aldridge in the presence of the delivery apprentice whose name you cannot recall. The invoice total, £42 sterling. His pen hovers again, this time over the quantity line. 6 gross becomes 5 3/4 gross. The total adjusts to £39, 4 shillings. He initials the correction in the margin, as if this were routine arithmetic error discovered during quarterly review. Thomas Aldridge trained you to measure laudanum doses with pharmaceutical precision, quarter-grain accuracy, brass instruments calibrated monthly. He did not train you to measure the interval between a crying infant and a silent one, but you have become very good at that too. He closes all 3 books simultaneously. His hands rest flat on the leather covers. The gaslight catches the brass pen case still sitting beside the inkwell, cap off, waiting. The September pattern, he says. Pritchard wasn't the only escalation. You know this already. Margaret Finch started at 2 ounces in July. 4 ounces by August. 6 ounces when she stopped coming in September, 3 weeks before her address appeared on Dr. Hartley's list. The Thursday coroner visits have taught you to recognize the trajectory before it completes. How many entries require adjustment, you ask? He doesn't answer immediately. His right hand moves to the September page again, finger tracing down the dates. September 3rd, RD September 9th. September 15th. September 23rd RD4 entries where the quantities exceed what a reasonable inspector would consider appropriate for declared symptoms. 4 in September, he says finally, possibly 7 in August. The pattern becomes obvious if someone compares the ledger against known outcomes. Known outcomes. He means the coroner certificates in Inspector Crew's leather case. The 62 children whose addresses match 62 transactions in your records, with the precision of pharmaceutical cross-reference. Cruz will arrive Thursday morning with 17 years of enforcement experience and a quota system that requires him to shutter pharmacies regardless of explanation. Inspector Cruz will bring the coroner lists, you say. He already has them. Aldridge straightens, leaving the books closed. The inspection notice was a courtesy. The investigation began when Dr. Hartley filed his quarterly mortality report with the Metropolitan Police Pharmaceutical Enforcement Division. Cruz has had 3 weeks to prepare his audit trail. The gaslight flickers. Somewhere in the front shop, the door opens and closes. A customer. The bell announces their arrival with the same brass clarity it's used for 3 years, indifferent to whether the transaction they're about to conduct will require later revision. I'll see to them, you say? Aldridge nods without looking up from the closed ledgers. His hands haven't moved from the covers. You leave him there with the evidence of what he's begun, knowing that by the time you return, more entries will have changed, and the documentation will reflect a pharmacy that never existed. The shop bell announces Mrs. Whitmore requesting her usual cough remedy. She's 63, a seamstress from Commercial Street, been coming in twice monthly since March. The request is always identical: 2 ounces laudanum tincture for the congestion that worsens in damp weather. You measure the dose with the brass spoon. 2 ounces exactly. The sweet poppy scent rises as you pour from the stock bottle into the amber glass container, mixing with the turpentine and camphor already thick in the closed air. The smell coats your throat. You've been breathing it for 3 years without registering its presence until this moment. 2 ounces, Mrs. Whitmore. That's 3 shillings. She counts the coins from a cloth purse. 3 shillings exact. You record her address and the date in the ledger with penmanship that matches Aldridge's original entries. The transaction takes 90 seconds from request to departure. 56 hours until Cruz arrives with his leather case and his enforcement quotas. The bell announces her exit. The bell announces Mr. Pemberton. Rheumatism relief. 4 ounces monthly customer since June. Pays 6 shillings without negotiation. You measure, record, collect payment. The pattern continues with mechanical rhythm. Mrs. Davies. Neuralgia. 2 ounces. Mr. Foster. Insomnia. 3 ounces. Young apprentice from the leather works on Brick Lane, collecting for his master's back pain. 6 ounces. The largest single dose of the morning. You measure it with the same precision as the 2-ounce requests, the brass spoon moving from stock bottle to customer bottle, with the accuracy of practiced routine. Each sale requires you to write a customer's address, knowing that address might appear on Dr. Hartley's next Thursday list. Each entry sits in permanent ink, documenting your participation in the system that Aldridge is currently revising in the back room. The morning continues. 11 transactions between 9 o'clock and noon. 23 ounces dispensed total. Each bottle labeled with pharmaceutical precision. Laudanum tincture. 2 dramans opium per fluid ounce. For external use only. Caution advised. The labels don't mention that external use recommendations haven't prevented internal consumption since the bottles first appeared on pharmacy shelves. The distinction between external and internal application exists in the labeling regulations, not in customer practice. You close the ledger at 12 o'clock when the midday lull settles. The entries fill 3 pages since Thursday's opening. 74 ounces dispensed in 4 days. The arithmetic matches the stock depletion. Everything balances with pharmaceutical precision, until you remember that the September 9th entry no longer reflects the transaction that actually occurred. The narcotic sweetness has thickened. Each opened bottle releases more of it into the air. Your tongue tastes it, your throat carries it. The brass measuring spoon still smells of it when you set it down beside the ledger. You realize you have been breathing this air for 3 years without noticing how it changes the texture of routine decisions. How it makes the interval between measuring a dose and recording an address feel like neutral professional conduct, rather than documentation of cause and effect. The shop sits quiet. No customers, no bell. Just the gaslight and the amber bottles and the leather ledger with its permanent ink rendering temporary relief into historical record. From the back room, no sound. Aldridge remains with the 3 books and the pen that changes 8s to 4s. How many entries has he adjusted while you measured morning doses? You don't go check. The transaction is his to complete. You're just maintaining the front shop operation, while he performs the revision surgery required for survival. The clock above the counter reads 12:17. Thursday morning approaches with the methodical certainty of Inspector Cruz' enforcement schedule. The bell announces another customer. The lunch hour lull gives you 30 minutes without interruption. You pull the ledger from January forward and spread the months across the counter. 11 months of entries. January through November. The pattern you've been recording without analyzing. Every Thursday morning, Dr. Hartley delivers his coroner list. You've watched this ritual for 44 consecutive weeks. The lists arrive in sealed envelopes. Aldridge opens them in the back room. He emerges 10 minutes later with the expression of someone who's just confirmed mathematics he already calculated. You start with Dr. Hartley's most recent list. September 26th delivery. 5 addresses. 47 Osborne Street, 12 Thrall Street, 8 George Yard, 23 Wentworth Street, 14 Dorset Street. You open the sales ledger to June, July, August, September. You trace purchase patterns. 47 Osborne Street. Sarah Pritchard. First purchase June 3rd, 2 ounces. Infant teething pain. Return June 10th, 4 ounces. Same complaint. June 17th, 6 ounces. June 24th, 6 ounces. July pattern continues weekly at 6 ounces. August escalates to 8 ounces. September 9th, 8 ounces. The entry Aldridge revised to 4. Time between first purchase and coroner list appearance, 16 weeks. 12 Thrall Street, Margaret Finch. First purchase July 8th, 2 ounces. Escalation pattern identical to Sarah Pritchard's. Final purchase, September 19th, 6 ounces. Stopped coming after that. Appeared on September 26th coroner list. Time between first purchase and death, 11 weeks. You work through the remaining 3 addresses. The intervals vary between 9 and 19 weeks. The escalation pattern remains constant. 2 ounces initial purchase. Gradual increase to 6 or 8 ounces. Then cessation of visits followed by coroner notification. You pull Dr. Hartley's previous lists from the filing drawer. August lists, July lists, June lists backward to December 1877. 44 lists total. You cross-reference against sales records. Every address on every list appears in your ledger. Every one. The intervals between first purchase and coroner notification average 17 days across 62 cases. The standard deviation, 4 days. The statistical correlation approaches unity with the precision of pharmaceutical measurement. Inspector Cruz will see it immediately. He's conducted these cross-references for 17 years. The labels on those bottles promise soothing relief for infant discomfort. They deliver exactly that. The bottles make no claims about duration. You close the ledgers and stack them in chronological order. The evidence sits in 11 leather-bound volumes, each entry witnessed by your penmanship or Aldridge's. Permanent ink documenting temporary relief, that became permanent cessation with statistical regularity. Inspector Cruz will bring his own ledgers, the coroner certificates. 62 addresses matched against 62 purchase patterns. The arithmetic requires no interpretation. The correlation demonstrates causation, with the clarity of controlled experiment, accidentally conducted across 11 months, in a Whitechapel pharmacy operating under standard dispensing practices. You were trained to measure laudanum with quarter-grain accuracy. Nobody trained you to measure the gap between professional competence and mass poisoning, but the gap has been measured anyway, documented in permanent ink, ready for cross-reference inspection in 56 hours. The shop bell remains silent. Aldridge remains in the back room with September's revised entries. The gas light burns steady above the counter, where 11 months of cause and effect sit, stacked in leather and brass and amber glass. Outside, a Metropolitan Police constable walks past the window on his afternoon round. His shadow crosses the counter briefly, then continues toward Whitechapel Road. You watch until he's gone. Aldridge returns from the back room at 2 o'clock. The ledger rests in both hands, like evidence being transported. The leather binding creaks when he sets it on the counter. The sound is sharp in the afternoon quiet. You look at the open pages. 17 entries show alterations, September and October. The quantities have been reduced by precise increments. Quarter-grain adjustments that suggest medical caution rather than mathematical desperation. Each alteration bleeds slightly where fresh ink meets old paper. The effect is a palimpsest of pharmaceutical accountability. He has revised the pattern. Conservative dispensing throughout. The stock records have been adjusted to match. The system is complete now. It contradicts the actual bottles that crossed this counter. But the documentation is internally consistent. Aldridge looks at you with the expression of someone who has just performed a necessary amputation. The inspection will focus on pattern, he says, not individual transactions. You nod. 17 adjustments across 11 months suggests vigilance, not negligence. His finger traces one of the altered entries. Your signature appears below it. September 9th. Sarah Pritchard. The quantity now reads 4 ounces instead of 8. Your signature appears on 12 of these entries, he says. The statement requires no response. You were the one who measured. You were the one who recorded. The ink that bled was yours initially. Now, it is his. Soon it will belong to Inspector Cruz, and whatever conclusion he draws from the pattern Aldridge has just created. The bell above the door announces a customer. Aldridge closes the ledger. The motion is decisive. What needed to be done is done. What survives is the documentation, not the truth. You watch him return the ledger to its place beneath the counter. His hands are steadier now than they were yesterday afternoon when you found him holding the pen above that first entry. The shaking has stopped. The decision has been made. What remains is execution. 54 hours until the inspection. The customer is Mrs. Whitmore, here for her husband's tonic. You measure 6 ounces of beef iron and wine preparation, while Aldridge attends to the cash drawer. The transaction is routine. Your hands do not shake. The measurement is precise. Nothing about this moment suggests that the ledger beneath the counter contains 17 lies that will determine whether this pharmacy remains open past Thursday morning. Mrs. Whitmore pays. Aldridge records the sale in clear, steady script. The entry will not require future revision. It is exactly what it appears to be. You watch her leave. The afternoon stretches ahead. Thursday morning approaches with the mechanical inevitability of a wound pocket watch. Inspector Cruz carries 62 death certificates in his leather case. Aldridge carries 17 altered entries in a ledger that now matches stock records that have also been revised. The calculation is clear. Whether they are sufficient is a question that will be answered in 54 hours by a man whose career advancement depends on shuttering at least 2 pharmacies per quarter. The Thursday afternoon customers arrive in their usual sequence. You notice for the first time how their requests have evolved. Medical language has shifted to mathematical precision over weeks and months. The phrasing has changed. My infant needs has become I require. Mrs. Dalton enters at 3 o'clock, her usual time. She requests her usual quantity, 4 ounces for teething pain. You measure while observing how her hands no longer shake when she pays. The transaction has become routine enough that she counts the coins before entering the shop. You record her address and date. Your penmanship matches the entries Aldridge has not yet altered. You calculate whether this transaction will require future revision. Whether your handwriting will be the one that bleeds when fresh ink meets old decisions. She thanks you, leaves. The bell marks her departure. You have learned to recognize the moment when a mother's request changes from medical to mathematical. The verb shifts from need to require, and the quantity becomes a calculation rather than a symptom. Your job is to fulfill the calculation without acknowledging what it solves for. Mrs. Hammond arrives at 3:30, 6 ounces. Her infant is 11 months old. She has been purchasing the same quantity since July. The progression has been steady, 2 ounces in May, 4 in June, 6 since July. The pattern is documented in entries that have not been altered because they fall outside the 11-month window Inspector Cruz will examine. You measure, record, accept payment. The ritual proceeds with pharmaceutical precision. Mr. Bradley comes at 4 o'clock for his mother's preparation. Laudanum and tincture of henbane for neuralgia. 8 ounces. The quantity has remained stable since his first purchase in March. He is not part of the pattern Aldridge has been obscuring. His mother is 67. She has neuralgia. The preparation serves its stated function without becoming permanent. You watch each customer depart. Each transaction adds a line to the ledger. Each line becomes evidence or exoneration, depending on how Inspector Cruz interprets the pattern. Aldridge has created a narrative of conservative dispensing through 17 careful alterations. Your current entries either support that narrative or contradict it. The afternoon light shifts. Gas light will be necessary soon. Outside, a Metropolitan Police constable passes the window on his usual patrol route. His presence reminds you that Inspector Cruz has 17 years in pharmaceutical enforcement. Methodical. Literate. Professionally committed to paperwork that matches. Thursday continues its mechanical progression toward Thursday morning. 48 hours remain. The customers continue to arrive. You continue to measure. The ledger continues to document what crosses this counter. The amber bottles on the shelf behind you catch the fading light. Each contains the same preparation. Each bears the same label promising relief. The labels make no claims about permanence. They do not need to. The mothers have learned the mathematics themselves. Whether what the ledger documents is sufficient to survive inspection is no longer a question you can influence through careful measurement. Dr. Hartley enters at 5 o'clock. His leather folder carries the bureaucratic weight of 48 weekly deliveries. He places the coroner list on the counter with the same neutral gesture as the previous 47. No variation. No acknowledgement of what the document contains. Simply delivery and departure. The paper feels thick between your fingers. Expensive municipal stock. 7 names this week, each with an address in your postal district. Each death certificate noting respiratory failure in children under 18 months. You recognize 4 addresses before you finish reading. Margaret Finch appears on the 3rd line. Aldridge emerges from the back room. His timing suggests he has been listening for Dr. Hartley's arrival. Thursday ritual. Cross-reference names against transactions. Mark correlations. Build documentation of a pattern he has just spent 6 hours obscuring. Dr. Hartley nods. Departs. The bell marks his exit. The folder remains on the counter between you and Aldridge. Aldridge opens the ledger to September. His pen marks small notations beside each correlation. The system he has created now encompasses both altered entries and Thursday's fresh casualties. The revised quantities suggest conservative dispensing. The correlations suggest the conservative dispensing was insufficient. Inspector Cruz will draw his own conclusions from the convergence. He is methodical. His leather case already contains 62 death certificates from the same postal district. Thursday morning he will add this week's 7 to his count. The arithmetic favors closure. You watch Aldridge work. His pen moves with steady precision. Each mark creates a connection between a sale and an outcome. The connections form a pattern. The pattern survives in documentation even after quantities have been altered to suggest caution. 4 addresses from this week's list appear in ledger entries you signed, 3 in September, 1 in early October. The quantities recorded are the revised quantities, conservative, cautious, suggesting pharmaceutical vigilance. The children are dead regardless. The ink smells sharp in the gaslight. You remember measuring the dose for Margaret Finch's mother, August. 8 ounces, the entry now reads 4. Your signature appears below both the original and the alteration. The revision makes you more cautious in the documentation than you were in the dispensing. Aldridge closes the ledger, returns the coroner list to its folder, files the folder with the previous 47. The Thursday ritual is complete. Documentation has been cross-referenced. Patterns have been noted. The inspection is 45 hours away. He looks at you across the counter. Neither of you speaks. What needed to be said was said through 17 alterations and 48 weekly correlations. What remains is waiting. The gaslight flickers. Evening settles over Whitechapel. Somewhere in this postal district 3 more mothers are measuring doses from amber bottles purchased at this counter. Whether those doses appear on next Thursday's coroner list is a question that will be answered after Inspector Cruz has already examined the ledger and drawn his conclusions about the pattern documented within. You lock the door at 6 o'clock. Aldridge remains in the back room with the stock records. Verification continues. The inspection approaches. The documentation is as complete as it can be made. After Dr. Hartley departs, you perform the evening cleaning ritual, the sound of the shop door latching marking the transition from public trade to private documentation. The brass measuring spoon clicks against glass bottlenecks as you return each container to alphabetical position on the mahogany shelves. Belladonna, chloral hydrate, laudanum, mercury compounds, opium tincture. Each click of brass against glass marks another measured dose recorded in the ledger, another transaction that exists in permanent ink regardless of whether the numbers have been revised. The brass measuring spoon holds exactly 1 dram. You polish it every morning because a clean instrument suggests clinical detachment, and clinical detachment suggests the outcomes are medical rather than inevitable. The spoon has no opinion on this logic. The amber bottles catch the light as you rotate them label forward. Mrs. Henderson's 8-ounce purchase from September 9th now reads 4 ounces in the revised ledger. The bottle returned empty on September 16th. The weight measured and recorded in your hand before you crushed it in the yard behind the shop. The glass broke. The ledger remains. You polish the brass spoon again, though it already gleams. The outcomes documented in Dr. Hartley's Thursday lists and the quantities recorded in your sales ledger exist in separate columns of the same permanent record, and whether the correlation between them constitutes negligent dispensing or inevitable outcome is a question that will be answered Thursday morning, October 20th at 9 o'clock by Inspector Malcolm Cruz, whose leather case contains 62 certificates you have not read. The chamois cloth moves in small circles against the brass. 3 years of this same motion, performed at closing each evening, the ritual that marks the boundary between professional duty and private knowledge. You set it in its designated drawer beside the pharmaceutical scales. The brass weights sit in their velvet-lined case, calibrated to measure grains with precision, that makes the difference between therapeutic dose and lethal quantity. Half a grain. Quarter grain. 1/8 grain increments that determine whether the infant sleeps or stops breathing. The ledger sits closed on the counter where Aldridge left it. 17 entries revised. His handwriting converting quantities that matched purchases into quantities that suggest moderation. The arithmetic is simple. 8 ounces becomes 4 ounces. 6 ounces becomes 3 ounces. The pattern holds across 11 months of Thursday lists. You lock the narcotic cabinet. The key turns with the mechanical precision of 15 years. Repetition. Securing inventory that no longer matches the revised documentation. The inspector will request to see both the ledger and the physical stock, and the discrepancy will require explanation that depends on whether the altered numbers or the actual bottles constitute evidence. The gas light dims as you turn the valve halfway. The shop settles into evening silence, the sound of commercial street traffic muted through the heavy door. 54 hours remain. The brass spoon rests in its drawer, polished clean, ready for tomorrow's first customer who will request a quantity you will measure with pharmaceutical precision, and document with permanent ink in a ledger that may or may not survive Thursday morning's inspection. You carry the ledger to the back room for storage. The leather binding feels heavier than its actual weight, the way objects gain mass when they contain decisions, rather than just documentation. The back room measures 12 feet by 8 feet, lined with supply shelves that hold bulk inventory, opium in sealed tins, morphine powder in glass jars, alcohol in gallon bottles. The pharmaceutical scales sit on the workbench, surrounded by measuring vessels calibrated in drams and ounces. This is where Aldridge spent yesterday afternoon with the ledger open beside him, revising entries while the shop bell announced customers you served alone. You set the ledger on the workbench. The pages where he made alterations sit slightly thicker than the rest, the fresh ink creating texture you can feel through the closed cover. 17 revisions that exist as physical evidence of choices made in the 72 hours before inspection. Your own handwriting appears throughout the book. 3 years of entries documenting transactions you performed with pharmaceutical precision, each address and quantity recorded according to regulations that assume documentation prevents harm rather than simply recording it. Mrs. Sarah Pritchard, 14 Whitechapel Road, 8 ounces laudanum, September 9th. Your signature at the bottom of the page, certifying the sale, was conducted according to the Pharmacy Act, 1868. The signature makes you complicit in whatever the entry documents. Whether that is legal sale of a regulated substance or negligent dispensing that contributed to the 62 deaths on Dr. Hartley's accumulated lists, depends on how Inspector Cruz interprets the correlation between addresses appearing in both records. 17 years in Metropolitan Police pharmaceutical enforcement. The kind of inspector who reads both columns. The binding's smooth-worn surface under your palms marks where you have rested your hands during 3 years of transcription. You calculate how many of those entries correlate with Dr. Hartley's accumulated lists. How many addresses you wrote became addresses you read. The mathematics exist whether or not you perform them. The workbench holds tools for pharmaceutical preparation, mortar and pestle, glass mixing vessels, measuring spoons in graduated sizes. The brass spoon from the counter drawer sits separate from these larger implements, designated specifically for laudanum measurement, because precision matters when calculating doses for infants whose weight determines whether 2 grams provides relief or cessation. You open the ledger to September. The revised entries show in Aldridge's handwriting beside your original documentation he did not erase. He struck through the original quantity with a single line, and wrote the new number above it, initialing each correction as if this were routine arithmetic error, discovered during quarterly review, rather than evidence tampering performed under pressure of imminent inspection. Mrs. Henderson's entry, 8 ounces crossed out, 4 ounces written above, Aldridge's initials TA in the margin. The bottle sold on September 9th. Returned empty September 16th. Address appearing on Dr. Hartley's list September 19th. Thomas Aldridge deciding in October what the September documentation should show, as if time runs backward when the alternative is enforcement. The pattern repeats across 11 months. The revisions cut every quantity in half, suggesting moderation that the actual transactions did not reflect. Whether this constitutes falsification of pharmaceutical records, or legitimate correction of transcription errors, is a legal distinction that matters considerably to whether the pharmacy remains licensed. You close the ledger. 51 hours remain before Inspector Cruz arrives to cross-reference these pages against the coroner certificates in his leather case. The ledger sits on the workbench, heavier than its physical weight, containing 3 years of documentation that makes you complicit in whatever truth survives contact with Metropolitan Police enforcement. Aldridge performs the closing procedures with the mechanical precision of 15 years of repetition. The sound of keys locking cabinet doors clicks through the empty shop, each lock securing inventory that no longer matches the revised ledger. He counts the cash drawer and records the day's receipts in the account book. The numbers match the sales you documented, which match the transactions that actually occurred, which no longer match the quantities recorded in the ledger that will face inspection. £4, 6 shillings, 3 pence. Thursday's take, slightly higher than average due to the Pritchard account, and 3 other laudanum purchases that followed Dr. Hartley's departure. The gaslight dims as he turns the valve. In the fading illumination you watch him check the police notice one final time, his finger tracing the printed text that announces Inspector Malcolm Cruz will arrive Thursday morning, October 20th, at 9 o'clock to conduct mandatory cross-reference inspection under Pharmacy Act, 1868 Section 17 enforcement. 60 hours, Aldridge says, not a question, a calculation spoken aloud. You nod. 60 hours remaining against the work already completed. The alterations that cannot be undone, even if the decision changes. 17 entries revised, each one cutting reported quantities in half, building documentation of moderation that the actual transactions did not reflect. He locks the front door and tests the handle twice. The street beyond shows evening traffic. Dock workers returning from the riverside. Women carrying market baskets, the usual commercial street flow. Normal Thursday activity. While inside this shop the ledgers document a pattern that may or may not constitute negligent dispensing, depending on how a Metropolitan Police inspector interprets the correlation between pharmaceutical sales and coroner certificates. Inspector Cruz has shut down 4 Bethnal Green pharmacies for negligent dispensing, which is what the Metropolitan Police call selling the legal product to the legal customer in the legal quantity when the customer then uses it for its intended purpose. The negligence is apparently in the documentation. Aldridge pulls his coat collar up against the October cold. Lock the back door after me, he says. Counts correct. Inventory's secured. Everything's in order. Everything except the ledger entries that no longer match the physical evidence of bottles sold and returned empty. Everything except the pattern that connects your documented sales to Dr. Hartley's documented deaths across 11 months of Thursday deliveries. Margaret Finch, 9 Dorset Street, 6 ounces in July, infant buried in August, coroner certificate filed in September. The pattern Inspector Cruz will recognize the moment he opens his leather case. You watch him leave through the back entrance, his footsteps fading into the alley behind the shop. The pharmacy settles into evening silence. 60 hours until 9 o'clock Thursday morning when Inspector Cruz arrives with his leather case of coroner certificates to determine whether the revised ledger entries constitute legitimate pharmaceutical practice or evidence of systematic negligent dispensing. The brass measuring spoon rests in its drawer, polished clean. The amber bottles sit alphabetical on their shelves. The ledger waits in the back room, heavier than its physical weight. You lock the back door as instructed, and test the handle twice, securing the pharmacy against everything except the inspection that arrives in 60 hours, regardless of how thoroughly you lock the doors. The storage room door sticks on Friday morning. You shoulder it open, smelling the concentrated narcotic sweetness that permeates this closed space. The amber bottles sit on their shelves in ranks of 12, labeled in Aldridge's precise hand: laudanum, chlorodyne, Dover's powder, Godfrey's cordial. 48 hours remain. Early light filters through the high window, illuminating dust suspended in air thick with opium vapor. You begin counting from the top shelf. 17 bottles of Winslow's soothing syrup, each containing 2 ounces. The stock record in your hand shows 19. 2 bottles unaccounted for, meaning 2 ounces times 17, that don't exist in physical reality, but exist on paper. The brass measuring spoon rests on the workbench where you left it last night. You pick it up, feeling the familiar weight. Each bottle represents doses measured with pharmaceutical precision. Each ledger entry represents those doses as evidence. You count the chlorodyne next. 23 bottles. The record shows 26. 3 missing. You write bottle breakage on the new inventory sheet, date it October 18th, and leave space for Aldridge's witness signature. The morning progresses through counting. Dover's powder, 11 bottles, record shows 14. Godfrey's cordial, 8 bottles, record shows 8. No discrepancy there. You mark it correct and continue. 30 minutes into the inventory, you've documented 17 discrepancies. 17 instances where the physical reality of narcotic stock doesn't match what the documentation claims should be here. Each gap represents sales Aldridge adjusted in the ledger, quantities reduced from what was actually dispensed. You fabricate spillage for 4 ounces, breakage for 6. Customer returns for 3. Each loss requires explanation, and each explanation is fiction supporting the primary fiction of revised quantities. The architecture of deception has layers. Aldridge enters without knocking. He carries the ledger under one arm and a pen in his hand. The tremor you noticed yesterday has steadied. He's slept or hasn't, but either way his professional composure has returned. The inventory corrections, he says. Not a question. You hand him the sheet. He reads it standing beside you, his breath visible in the cold storage room air. The fabricated losses total 23 ounces across 6 products. Each entry explains what happened to narcotic stock that never existed as stock, because it was sold in quantities the ledger no longer admits. Spillage during decanting, he reads aloud. Bottle breakage during evening cleaning, customer return due to adverse reaction. He looks at each shelf as he reads, verifying the bottles match your count. 17 discrepancies. 17. You confirm. He signs each corrected entry with the same precision he uses for everything pharmaceutical. His signature appears beside yours on every line, making both of you witness to losses that didn't happen. The mutual documentation distributes responsibility without reducing anyone's portion of it. The morning customers begin arriving in 20 minutes, he says. I'll need you behind the counter while I work on the October entries. The October entries. He's expanding the revisions beyond September, adjusting this month's sales to match the pattern of pharmaceutical caution. The altered ledger now claims has existed since December 1877. Yesterday's sales will be changed today. This morning's sales will be changed tomorrow. You follow him back to the shop. The gaslight has been lit early against the morning dark. The mahogany counter gleams where someone polished it recently. The bell above the door waits to announce the first customer. Aldridge opens the ledger to October 17th. Your entries from yesterday fill half a page. 6 sales, quantities ranging from 4 to 8 ounces, each documented with address and initials. He studies them with the measuring spoon still in his other hand, as if weighing doses against entries. The Pritchard account, he says. 8 ounces yesterday. You remember. Sarah Pritchard, 9 o'clock, her usual quantity. The infant's weight used as justification, without being asked. Aldridge makes the first stroke. The 8 becomes 4. The rest of yesterday's entries follow the same pattern. Conservative doses becoming more conservative. The pharmaceutical precision of your original documentation matched by the historical imprecision of overnight revision. Both recorded in permanent ink. The shop bell announces Sarah Pritchard at 9 o'clock Friday morning. Same time as every previous Friday for 11 months. The sound carries no indication her account has been revised. She approaches the counter while Aldridge remains in the back room with the ledger open to October. You recognize her coat, her posture, the way she walks directly to the counter without browsing the display of medicinal soaps and tonics arranged near the window. The usual quantity, she says. Not quite a question. The infant's weight will be mentioned next, it always is. You measure 8 ounces into an amber bottle while she watches. The brass spoon transfers laudanum from stock container to individual sale with mechanical repetition. 1 ounce. 2. 3. The narcotic sweetness intensifies with each measure. 4. 5. 6. He's 11 pounds now, Sarah Pritchard says. Still not sleeping more than 2 hours. 7 ounces. 8. You cork the bottle and write the transaction in today's ledger entry. October 18th, 1878. Sarah Pritchard. 14 Dorset Street. 8 ounces laudanum. 6 shillings. Your hand moves with the same precision Aldridge trained into you 3 years ago. She pays 6 shillings in coins that clink against the mahogany counter. The sound is routine, familiar, part of the Friday morning rhythm that has repeated 48 times since December 1877. You watch her leave. The bell announces her departure with the same bright chime that announced her arrival. Through the window you see her turn north on Whitechapel Road, heading back toward Dorset Street, where her address appears in Thursday's coroner list for 6 consecutive weeks between March and April. Not the same address, the same infant. Aldridge emerges from the back room. He glances at today's entry, then opens the ledger to last Friday, October 11th. The entry shows Sarah Pritchard purchased 8 ounces. His pen hovers above the number. Inspector Cruz will cross-reference purchases against household size, he says. 8 ounces weekly for a single infant appears excessive. He makes the correction, the 8 becomes 4. Last week's transaction revised to show half the quantity you actually measured. The discrepancy between what you measured then and what the documentation now claims creates a gap you must navigate every time you see this entry. Sarah Pritchard purchased 8 ounces last Friday. The ledger shows 4. Both facts are true, both are recorded. Only one exists in permanent ink. This morning's entry sits 2 pages later. 8 ounces purchased 10 minutes ago. The bottle left with her. The number waits in fresh ink for whatever correction Aldridge decides it requires tomorrow or next week, when the pattern of pharmaceutical caution must appear consistent across 11 months. Through the back window you hear hooves on cobblestone, a carriage passing, someone's morning commute. The rhythm of Friday in Whitechapel continues around the pharmacy, while inside, every transaction becomes provisional until Aldridge decides what it needs to have been. Thomas Aldridge changes the September 9th entry from 8 ounces to 4 ounces with a pen stroke that requires 3 attempts because his hand shakes. The pharmacological precision of the original sale is matched only by the historical imprecision of the alteration. Both are recorded in permanent ink. You return to the counter. The next customer will arrive soon. The morning proceeds through its routine, while the documentation of that routine gets revised in real time behind you. Inspector Malcolm Cruz has 17 years in pharmaceutical enforcement. He knows what altered ledgers look like. The architecture of complicity has daily maintenance requirements. You find Aldridge in the back room at 2 o'clock Friday afternoon. The ledger lies open to October, his pen hovering above Wednesday's entries. Not last week's Wednesday. This week's. Yesterday's sales. He's expanding the revisions. The tremor has returned worse than Thursday. It extends from fingers to wrist to elbow, making the pen shake above the page in small circular motions. Ink has bled onto the margin where he attempted a correction and aborted it halfway through. The inspection requires pattern consistency, he says without looking up. You've been standing in the doorway for 30 seconds. He knew you were there. Isolated conservative doses appear suspicious. The entire 11 months must demonstrate the same pharmaceutical caution. You watch him change Wednesday's 6-ounce sale to 4 ounces. The original number disappears under careful ink strokes that require 3 attempts. His breathing sounds deliberate, controlled, the way someone breathes when they're trying not to shake. He moves to Tuesday's entry. 5 ounces becomes 3. Monday's 7 becomes 5. The pattern of alteration spreads backward through October, like water seeping through paper. Each change requiring corresponding inventory adjustments you'll need to fabricate tonight after closing. These were yesterday's sales, you say. Yesterday's sales become today's evidence. Aldridge sets the pen down, his hand continues trembling without it. Inspector Cruz arrives Thursday morning with 62 coroner certificates. Each certificate names an address. Each address appears in this ledger. The quantities must be defensible. He picks up the pen again. Your entries from this morning wait on the next page. Sarah Pritchard, 8 ounces. The correction will happen tonight or tomorrow. The pharmaceutical precision of 9 o'clock becomes the historical fiction of overnight revision. Every transaction since December needs review, Aldridge continues. The pattern must appear intentional, not reactive. Conservative dispensing as professional practice, not panic revision after inspection notice. His voice remains steady while his hands shake. Professional detachment maintained through pharmaceutical vocabulary that doesn't name what's being done. Conservative dispensing. Pattern consistency. Defensible quantities. Not evidence tampering. Not documentation fraud. You realize he's been in this room since the shop closed at noon for lunch. 2 hours alone with 11 months of entries, changing numbers that were correct when written, but insufficient for Thursday's inspection. The ledger shows corrections on 20 pages, maybe more. October spreads backward into September, September into August. The inventory adjustments, you say. Tonight after closing, Aldridge makes another correction. 23 ounces fabricated loss for yesterday's revisions. Today's changes require another 37. I'll sign your corrections. You'll sign my ledger changes. The mutual documentation continues. Each layer of fiction requires witness signatures that distribute responsibility across 2 people instead of 1. The architecture expands. 42 hours, you say. Aldridge looks up for the first time. His face carries the expression of someone who has stopped calculating odds of survival and moved to calculating minimum acceptable damage. Thursday morning, 9 o'clock, he says. Inspector Malcolm Cruz arrives with his leather case. Everything in this ledger becomes evidence or explanation depending on which pattern he decides to see. He returns to the corrections. You leave him there with October's entries bleeding into September's revisions, bleeding into August's professional documentation of doses measured with pharmaceutical precision 3 months ago, when you thought recording transactions honestly was the same as recording them correctly. The shop bell announces another customer. You return to the counter while Aldridge continues changing what actually happened into what needs to have happened for survival. The narcotic sweetness has permeated everything. Even your clothes smell like laudanum now. The Saturday afternoon customers arrive in their usual sequence. Margaret Finch at 2 o'clock, requesting 8 ounces of Godfrey's cordial, her weekly quantity unchanged since July. William Moss at 3, collecting his mother's prescription, 2 ounces of morphine sulfate dissolved in brandy. The transactions proceed with the mechanical precision of pharmaceutical routine, each quantity measured, each entry recorded, each bottle wrapped in brown paper, and tied with string that your hands know how to knot without conscious thought. Sarah Pritchard arrives at 4:30. She approaches the counter with the same quick step she's carried for 11 consecutive Saturdays, though her infant daughter weighs 9 pounds now, documented in your mental calculations with the same precision you apply to grain measurements. The child sleeps against her shoulder, wrapped in a shawl that shows threadbare edges at the seams. "The usual amount, please," Sarah says. "Not a question." Never a question, though her voice frames it that way. She's been restless again this week. The weight gain is good, isn't it? 9 pounds at 4 months. The apothecary in Bethnal Green said that was within normal range when I asked last month. You measure 12 ounces of Winslow's soothing syrup into an amber bottle. The liquid catches the gaslight as it pours, honey-colored medicinal sweetness coating the back of your throat even through the distance between counter and measuring station. Each ounce contains 0.4 grains of morphine sulfate. You have performed these calculations enough times that the numbers appear without effort. 12 ounces, you say, corking the bottle. For the week, she adds, though you haven't asked. Sometimes twice daily, sometimes 3 times, depending on the crying. The doctor in Commercial Street said regular doses prevent the worst of the teething pain. Better than letting her suffer through it, he said. You wrap the bottle. Your hands execute the brown paper fold, the string knot, the label inscription with her address on Dorset Street, all while your mind performs arithmetic that pharmaceutical training makes automatic. 12 ounces over 7 days, administered to a 9-pound infant in doses Sarah describes as twice or 3 times daily. Sarah Pritchard returns for the 11th week, requesting her usual quantity, which is twice her original quantity, but half of what would constitute an overdose for an adult. Her infant weighs 9 pounds. The mathematics are clear enough that you do not need to perform them. 1 shilling 6pence, you say. She counts the coins onto the mahogany counter with fingers that show laundress's roughness, the skin cracked around the knuckles. You record the transaction in the ledger. Tom's October 19, 1878. S. Pritchard, Dorset Street. Winslow's soothing syrup, 12 ounces, 1s, 6d. Your handwriting maintains its pharmaceutical clarity, each letter formed with the precision that 3 years of training has made involuntary. You know Aldridge will revise this entry to 8 ounces tomorrow morning. You know the revision will not change what crossed the counter. Sarah Pritchard tucks the wrapped bottle into her marketing basket, adjusts the sleeping infant on her shoulder, and turns toward the door. The shop bell announces her departure with the same brass clarity it announced her arrival. The ledger entry sits in permanent ink. 12 ounces documented with pharmaceutical precision. You close the sales register and place it on the shelf beneath the counter, where it will rest until tomorrow morning when Aldridge arrives to perform the Sunday alterations that have become part of the weekly routine, as regular as inventory counts and mortar cleaning. The gaslight flickers. Outside the shop window, Whitechapel Road carries its Saturday evening traffic, costermongers, carts returning from market, factory workers heading toward the public houses on Commercial Street. The steady percussion of iron wheels on cobblestones that marks the transition from commerce to rest. You perform the evening cleaning procedures. Mortar and pestle scrubbed clean, measuring spoons return to their drawer. The mahogany counter wiped down with the chamois cloth that removes the day's accumulation of powder residue and finger marks. Each task executed with the mechanical efficiency of repetition, your hands knowing the sequence without conscious direction. The amber bottles on the dispensing shelf catch the gaslight. Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Winslow's quieting syrup, Dover's powder, each label printed with dosage instructions that assume adult administration, each bottle containing concentrations calibrated for adult tolerance. The pharmaceutical precision that makes you competent at your profession is the same precision that makes the weekly pattern visible. Addresses appearing in Thursday's coroner lists, 6 to 8 weeks after their first appearance in your sales ledger, the interval as regular as any other documented pharmaceutical effect. 36 hours remain until Inspector Cruz arrives. Sunday morning brings the pharmacy closed, and Aldridge requesting you join him in the back room. The leather-bound ledger sits open on the workbench. Saturday's entries fill the final page of October's weekly record, your handwriting maintaining its pharmaceutical clarity across 12 separate transactions. The brass pen rests beside the ledger, its nib cleaned and ready, the inkwell positioned at the precise angle that makes alteration work easier than original inscription. Aldridge stands with both hands flat on the workbench surface. The October light through the back room's single window falls across the ledger pages, illuminating the permanent ink that documents 3 months of dispensing transactions. From Whitechapel Road comes the reduced Sunday traffic, a coal wagon passing, church bells at St. Mary's marking the hour. Inspector Cruz will arrive in 4 days with his leather case and 17 years of pharmaceutical enforcement experience. Inspector Cruz arrives Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, he says. His voice carries the same procedural tone he uses for instructing you in pharmaceutical compounding. The pattern must be consistent across all entries regardless of which hand recorded them. You understand what he is not saying directly. Your signature appears on transactions spanning September through October, quantities documented in your handwriting that will require alteration to match the narrative of conservative dispensing that might survive inspection. Your signature on the alterations distributes legal liability, Aldridge continues. If the inspection discovers the changes, the question becomes whether we both participated in documentation revision, or whether I acted alone without your knowledge. The distinction matters for prosecution purposes under Pharmacy Act enforcement. He picks up the brass pen and places it on the workbench between you and the ledger. The pen feels heavier than its actual weight when you lift it. Heavier than the brass measuring spoons in the dispensing room drawer. Heavier than the leather ledger that documents 3 years of transactions, heavier than any physical object you have handled in the course of pharmaceutical work that trains precision into involuntary muscle memory. September 9th, Aldridge says, turning the ledger pages backward. Your handwriting, 8 ounces to Pritchard Dorset Street, revised to 4 ounces. Initial the correction in the margin. The entry sits in permanent ink. Time September 9, 1878, S. Pritchard Dorset Street, Winslow's Soothing Syrup, 8 ounces ones. Your handwriting, your professional precision, your documentation of a transaction that crossed the mahogany counter in the quantities you measured, while Sarah Pritchard watched you pour, with the attention mothers give to substances they will administer to their children. You calculate £3 monthly wage, earned through pharmaceutical work performed with competence sufficient that Aldridge trusts you with narcotic dispensing. 3 years of training in pharmaceutical precision that makes you employable in any London chemist shop that requires qualified assistance. Against these, the addresses that will appear on Thursday's coroner list, regardless of what numbers you write in this margin, the pattern of correlation between sales records and death certificates that Inspector Cruz will cross-reference with bureaucratic thoroughness. You place the pen above the September 9th entry. Your hand begins the same tremor that has marked Aldridge's alterations. The involuntary shake that comes from understanding that professional precision cuts both directions. The skill that makes you competent at measuring morphine sulfate to quarter-grain accuracy is the same skill that makes you aware of what those measurements do when administered to 9-pound infants over 11 consecutive weeks. The brass pen point touches the ledger page above the 8. In that moment you understand. The decision is not whether to change the numbers, but whether changing them makes you complicit in the deaths, or complicit in the documentation. The distinction dissolves like ink in water, 2 separate fluids becoming one solution with properties different from either original substance. You draw a careful line through the 8, and write 4 above it in the same pharmaceutical script that recorded the original entry. Your initials in the margin, the documentation of your participation in revision that transforms permanent records into narrative that might survive Thursday's inspection. The altered entry reads, 5 September 9, 1878, S. Pritchard, Dorset Street. Winslow's soothing syrup, ~, 8, ~, 4 ounces, 1s. Aldridge's signature appears beside your initials, witnessing the correction with the formal precision that pharmaceutical record-keeping requires for legal validity. By Sunday afternoon, you have revised 23 entries spanning September through October. The pattern of alteration runs backward through the ledger pages like careful erosion, each reduction calculated to suggest conservative pharmaceutical practice rather than panic revision after inspection notice. 8 ounces becomes 4, 12 ounces becomes 8, 6 ounces becomes 3. The reductions follow quarter increment logic, demonstrating the professional vigilance that inspectors expect from qualified chemist assistants working under proper supervision. Your handwriting matches Aldridge's in the careful bleeding of fresh ink over permanent records. The alterations sit in the margins with the formal precision that makes them appear as routine corrections discovered during quarterly review rather than systematic revision performed 36 hours before mandatory inspection. Each altered entry carries your initials and Aldridge's witness signature. The documentation of your complicity sits in permanent ink beside the documentation of the transactions, both equally permanent and equally false. The ledger now tells a story of cautious dispensing, quarter grain reductions demonstrating pharmaceutical restraint, a pattern of medical care that contradicts the actual bottles that crossed the mahogany counter, but supports the narrative that might survive Inspector Cruz's examination. The backroom smells like fresh ink and narcotic sweetness, the concentrated air of the closed space, carrying the pharmaceutical scent that permeates everything you touch. Your clothes smell like laudanum now. Your hands carry the sticky residue that chamois cloth never completely removes. The physical presence of the work saturates the sensory environment, the way the moral weight saturates every transaction recorded in the leather-bound ledger. Aldridge closes the revised ledger and returns it to the shelf beneath the counter. The brass pen goes back in its drawer, the nib cleaned, the inkwell corked. The workbench surface shows no evidence of the Sunday afternoon's work beyond the faint odor of iron gall ink dissipating into the pharmaceutical air. Thursday morning, he says, 9 o'clock. Inspector Cruz will request access to sales records and inventory documentation. The cross-reference examination typically requires 4 to 6 hours depending on volume. You understand? 36 hours remain to maintain the pharmaceutical routine that makes the alterations appear as normal practice rather than evidence of systematic revision. Thursday afternoon deliveries. Friday morning inventory. Saturday customer transactions. The mechanical precision of professional competence must continue without variation, because variation itself becomes evidence that something changed after the inspection notice arrived. The shop bell announces Dr. Edmund Hartley's arrival through the front door. He carries the leather folder containing this Thursday's coroner list with the bureaucratic courtesy of a man who has delivered 47 previous lists and will deliver 47 more. His greeting maintains the professional neutrality that makes these weekly exchanges possible. Acknowledgement without commentary, documentation without judgment, the mechanical transfer of official records that both parties understand connects to patterns neither will name directly. Thursday's certification list. Dr. Hartley says, placing the folder on the mahogany counter. Postal District E1. Children under age 2. Causes documented as respiratory failure, convulsive disorder, and teething complications. The folder sits between you like evidence at an inquest. You know before opening it that certain addresses will appear. Margaret Finch's address on Flower and Dean Street. Thomas Aldridge never speaks her son's name, but the boy was 6 months old when the weekly Godfrey's cordial purchases began in July. You know the correlation between this list and your sales ledger will demonstrate the pattern that Inspector Cruz will examine with bureaucratic thoroughness on Thursday morning. You know Dr. Hartley knows. You know he delivers these lists with professional detachment, because acknowledging the correlation would make the delivery impossible. "Thank you," Aldridge says, accepting the folder without opening it. Dr. Hartley departs. The shop bell marks his exit with brass clarity. The leather folder rests on the counter, containing documentation of outcomes that pharmaceutical precision makes inevitable. Morphine sulfate, administered to 9-pound infants in quantities. Your training makes you competent to measure, and your experience makes you competent to predict. The addresses will match, the dates will correlate, the pattern will demonstrate what everyone involved understands without stating directly. You place the unopened folder in the drawer beneath the counter, where it will remain until Thursday morning when Inspector Cruz requests access to all documentation relevant to narcotic dispensing practices in Whitechapel Postal District E1 between December 1877 and October 1878. His leather case contains 62 death certificates. 62 children, whose names you will never learn, whose faces you never saw, whose mothers crossed the threshold of this pharmacy, seeking relief that pharmaceutical precision delivered in doses calculated to adult tolerances. 4 days of pharmaceutical routine stretch ahead like the careful space between acknowledging what you know and stating it aloud. Monday dawn brings rehearsal. You arrive before Aldridge with the keys to the pharmacy, unlock the mahogany counter cabinet, and begin the staging that transforms documentation into performance. Amber bottles alphabetically arranged. Brass measuring instruments polished to mirrors. The ledger positioned on the counter with casual accessibility, spine aligned with the counter edge, cover angled slightly open as if you consulted it moments ago. The gaslight casts no shadows across the revised entries, you verified that Friday. From standing position behind the counter, the September pages show uniform ink density. The alterations sit where they belong, integrated into the permanent record rather than imposed upon it. Aldridge enters at 7:45 carrying his leather folder. He sets it beside the ledger without comment, opens directly to September 9th. His finger traces the line showing 4 ounces to S. Pritchard, Dorset Street address. The number sits in ink that matches the surrounding entries because you verified the bottle Friday afternoon, mixing the pigment to pharmaceutical specification. Inspector Cruz will ask about discrepancies first, Aldridge says. Stock records against sales records. He establishes the foundation before examining individual transactions. You retrieve the stock ledger from the cabinet. The revised inventory corrections span March through October. 17 entries documenting breakage, spillage, and measurement error. Each supported by witness signatures you fabricated Friday night, dates matching the inventory adjustments, explanations detailed enough to satisfy bureaucratic scrutiny, but not so detailed they invite further questions. 27 hours now. The interval between rehearsal and inspection narrows with each page Aldridge turns. Aldridge conducts his rehearsal with the precision of someone who has already identified every vulnerability. He opens the stock ledger to March. Calculates wholesale purchases against recorded sales, against current inventory. The mathematics align because you made them align, subtracting the revised quantities from the original totals, and documenting the difference as operational loss. 17 discrepancies, he says, normal range for 11 months operation. Metropolitan Police Enforcement Guidelines allow up to 24 documented losses per annum, before triggering expanded investigation. He asks the questions Inspector Cruz will ask. You respond with the pharmaceutical terminology you practiced for 3 years. Conservative dispensing protocols. Documented consultation with prescribing physicians. Sales records cross-referenced against customer addresses to prevent duplicate purchases. The rehearsal proceeds through morning light strengthening beyond the shop windows. Aldridge examines each revised entry with the scrutiny of someone who knows which numbers changed, and has constructed supporting documentation to match. He asks about the Pritchard account. You describe the consultation pattern, weekly visits, infant weight documented, dose calculated to established protocols. The coroner list shows Dorset Street address 3 weeks after final purchase, Aldridge says. Inspector Cruz will note the correlation. Conservative dispensing as documented, you reply, 4 ounces across 6 weeks, within established therapeutic guidelines. The ledger passes his examination, not because the entries are accurate, because they are coherent. The fiction holds together as long as every supporting document reinforces the narrative of careful pharmaceutical practice. And you spent 72 hours ensuring the documentation creates a structure that supports itself through mutual verification. At 9 o'clock you open the shop for Monday morning customers. The bell announces Mrs. Fletcher from Commercial Street requesting her monthly laudanum supply. You measure 2 ounces with the brass spoon, record the transaction in real time, permanent ink documenting present truth beside past revision. The new entry sits 3 lines below the altered September notation. Same handwriting, same ink concentration, same format. The juxtaposition creates a palimpsest, where documentation exists in layers. What happened recorded beside what you claim happened, both permanent, both equally real, within the bound pages of pharmaceutical accountability. Aldridge remains in the back room with the stock records. You hear pages turning as he conducts his final verification. The sound carries the weight of 62 names on coroner lists, Thomas Aldridge among them, though his daughter's death preceded your employment here. Sarah Pritchard's infant will be 63 when Inspector Cruz opens his leather case tomorrow morning. 24 hours remain. The pharmacy continues its routine, while the revised ledgers wait on the counter, staged for inspection. Every altered number supported by fabricated documentation that transforms coverage into conservative practice. Inspector Malcolm Cruz enters at 10 o'clock Tuesday morning. 43 years old, 17 years Metropolitan Police Pharmaceutical Enforcement. He carries a leather folder containing coroner certificates and enforcement documentation. His introduction carries bureaucratic courtesy that acknowledges your professional standing while making clear the inspection is mandatory under Pharmacy Act 1868 Section 17. Sales ledger and stock records, he says. Statement, not request. Aldridge provides both. His hands no longer shake. The tremor that marked Thursday afternoon has transformed into steady confidence now that the alterations are complete and the supporting documentation prepared. He opens the ledger to January. Cruz begins his cross-reference at the year's start, rather than working backward from present date. The methodology is deliberate. He establishes baseline practices before examining question transactions. Verifies you maintained consistent documentation standards. Confirms sales recorded in chronological order with no gaps suggesting removed pages. You watch from behind the counter. The pharmacy remains open during inspection. Mrs. Henderson arrives requesting rheumatism tonic. You measure the dose while Inspector Cruz sits at the consultation table with the ledger open to March, his finger moving down each entry, matching dates against his enforcement folder. He does not speak during examination. The silence fills the pharmacy like weight. Aldridge stands beside the consultation table prepared to answer questions. You continue morning routine, measuring doses, recording sales, maintaining the operational rhythm that demonstrates competence, rather than anxiety. At 10:45 Cruz reaches September. His finger pauses at the 9th. The entry showing 4 ounces to Sarah Pritchard, Dorset Street address. The ink sits slightly darker, where 8 ounces used to be, but from reading distance the variation appears as natural inconsistency within batch mixed permanent ink. Conservative dispensing protocols, Cruz says. Reading the marginal notation Aldridge added Friday. Consultation with prescribing physician, Aldridge replies. Documented in correspondence file. Cruz requests the correspondence file. Aldridge retrieves it from the cabinet. The letter you fabricated Friday night sits between legitimate physician communications. Dr. Hartley recommending reduced dosage for Pritchard account based on infant weight calculations, dated September 7th, signature forged with pharmaceutical precision. The inspector examines the letter, compares the signature against other Hartley correspondence in the file, returns it without comment. Continues his cross-reference through October. You measure afternoon doses while he works. The brass spoon requires steady hands. You maintain them. Each transaction recorded in real time while Inspector Cruz sits 3 feet away, verifying your past recordings against coroner certificates documenting addresses that appear in both your ledger and his death records. Margaret Finch appears on his list. You revised her quantity from 6 ounces to 3, the difference now documented as spillage during March bulk transfer, witnessed by a signature you forged using her own initials as model. At noon he reaches October 20th. Present date. He has examined 11 months of pharmaceutical sales and found documentation that supports conservative practice rather than negligent dispensing. The question now is whether adequate documentation means sufficient documentation. Whether the structure you built to contain the alterations will survive forensic examination of its foundation. Stock records, Cruz says. Aldridge provides the inventory ledger. Cruz opens to March and begins calculating wholesale purchases against recorded sales against current inventory. You watch his finger trace the mathematics. The numbers align because you made them align, but the alignment itself may indicate fabrication rather than accuracy. 17 discrepancies where bottles were documented as broken or spilled. Cruz notes each one. His finger pauses at the May notation showing 3 ounces lost to measurement error during bulk transfer. The explanation is detailed enough to be believable, specific enough to be verified, and completely fabricated. Witness signatures required for inventory corrections, Cruz says. Maintained per regulation, Aldridge replies. The signatures you forged Friday night using leftover customer receipts as models, Cruz examines them. Compares initials against previous witness verifications in the stock ledger. The forgeries hold because you practiced them until the pen pressure matched the original signatures. The inspection continues through afternoon light. Cruz requests the basement stock for physical verification. You accompany him down mahogany stairs into narcotic sweetness concentrated by closed air. He counts bottles. Matches quantities against inventory records. Finds numbers that align with documentation showing conservative pharmaceutical practice. At 3 o'clock he closes the stock ledger, returns upstairs. Sits at the consultation table with both ledgers open, your 11 months of pharmaceutical operations spread before him in permanent ink that shows either careful practice or careful coverage, depending on which narrative the documentation supports. Inspector Cruz moves to the back room at 3:15. The sound of pages turning fills the small space as he cross-references stock records against ledger entries against his coroner certificates. You remain behind the counter. The pharmacy stays open. Customers continue arriving. Mr. Walsh requests his weekly laudanum supply. You measure 2 ounces. Record the transaction. The entry sits on the same page, where Inspector Cruz just verified September sales. Present truth documented beside past revision. Both permanent, both equally subject to his examination if he returns to re-verify. Through the backroom doorway you see Cruz at Aldridge's desk, the stock ledger open beside the sales ledger beside his enforcement folder. His finger moves between documents. Wholesale purchase dated March 4th. Corresponding sales entries March 4th through 18th. Inventory notation March 19th, showing 1 bottle broken during shelf reorganization. The notation is fabricated. The bottle was not broken. It was sold to Margaret Finch in a quantity you later revised to half the original amount, and the difference between what you sold and what you recorded selling now appears in stock records as documented operational loss. His leather case sits open on the desk. The coroner certificates inside document 62 children. You know 3 names now. Thomas Aldridge's daughter, Sarah Pritchard's infant, Margaret Finch. The others remain anonymous in your memory, reduced to addresses that correlate with your sales records, quantities you cannot recall with precision, because you measured them in routine rather than urgency. Aldridge stands in the doorway between front room and back, not supervising, available. His posture demonstrates confidence in the documentation, while remaining prepared to provide clarification if questioned. The performance requires precision. Too much confidence suggests fabrication, too little suggests guilt, and pharmaceutical practice demands neither but rather professional competence maintained under regulatory scrutiny. At 4 o'clock, Cruz identifies the 17 discrepancies. He does not ask about them immediately. Instead, he calculates their cumulative quantity, 23 ounces across 11 months. Then he examines the witness signatures supporting each inventory correction. The signatures belong to customers who witnessed routine pharmaceutical operations, shelf reorganization, bulk transfer procedures, quarterly inventory verification. You selected witnesses carefully Friday night. Chose names that appeared frequently in sales records. Forged initials that match their documented signatures on previous receipts. These witnesses, Cruz says. Available for verification? Regular customers, Aldridge replies. Commercial street addresses. Available at their residences. The answer is true. The signatures are false. But Inspector Cruz cannot verify signatures without visiting 17 separate addresses and requesting customers confirm they witnessed pharmaceutical operations they have no memory of witnessing, because the operations never occurred. The bureaucratic cost exceeds the enforcement value for discrepancies within acceptable operational range. Cruz returns to his cross-reference. Matches each inventory correction against corresponding sales patterns. The corrections appear distributed across 11 months rather than clustered near inspection date. The distribution suggests ongoing operational loss rather than retrospective coverage. This is why you fabricated March through October corrections, rather than documenting all losses in the 72 hours before inspection. At 4:30, Cruz closes the stock records, returns to the consultation table, opens the sales ledger to September. His finger finds the Pritchard entry showing 4 ounces. Then he opens his enforcement folder to the coroner certificate dated October 2nd showing Dorset Street address. Conservative dispensing as documented, he says. Not a question, a notation. He records it in his enforcement documentation. Pharmaceutical practice consistent with established protocols. Supporting correspondence on file. Quantities within therapeutic guidelines, despite correlation between sales records and mortality records. The notation means the structure holds. The documentation supports itself through mutual verification. What you sold and what you recorded selling exist in separate realities, but the permanent ink creates a third reality, where only the recorded version matters, because it is the only version subject to regulatory verification. At 5 o'clock, Cruz stands, collects his folder, addresses Aldridge with formal courtesy acknowledging the inspection is complete, and the pharmacy operation meets Metropolitan Police enforcement standards under current regulatory framework. He departs through the front door, the bell announces his exit, you watch him turn north on Whitechapel Road until he disappears into evening foot traffic. His quota requires 2 pharmacy closures per quarter. Yours will not be one of them. Aldridge closes the ledger, returns it to the cabinet. The revised entries sit between mahogany covers, containing 11 months of pharmaceutical operation that survived regulatory inspection, because you spent 72 hours transforming coverage into conservative practice. The wall clock measures the interval between inspection and verdict. Each second marks the space where truth and documentation exist in separate realities. What happened sits beside what you claimed happened, both permanent, both equally real within the structure of pharmaceutical accountability that values documentation over accuracy, because only documentation can be verified through institutional examination. The pharmacy continues its routine. You measure evening doses, record transactions, maintain the operational rhythm that demonstrates professional competence rather than moral complicity, because acknowledging what the ledger documents would make the documentation impossible, and the documentation is what survived. Inspector Cruz returns to the consultation table at 2 o'clock. places the stock records beside the open ledgers. Sits. The records demonstrate adequate oversight, he says. You stand behind the mahogany counter, where you have measured doses for 3 years. Aldridge stands beside you. The consultation table between you carries 11 months of documentation arranged in the order Cruz requested, each page turned to face him in the configuration that presents pharmaceutical competence rather than moral complicity. Conservative dispensing practices, Cruz continues. His pen moves across the inspection form in strokes that transform observation into institutional verdict, consistent with Pharmacy Act 1868 requirements. The pen stops. He looks up. The pattern of losses requires additional documentation. Aldridge's hand rests on the counter, does not move. Within the fortnight, Cruz says, I will return for follow-up verification. The correlation between your sales district and the coroner certificates necessitates continued vigilance. He stands. Gathers the inspection forms into his leather case with the mechanical precision of a man who has shuttered 4 pharmacies in Bethnal Green, and will shutter more before the enforcement quota resets in January. The brass clasp clicks shut. The pharmacy will remain open pending final review. You hear the sentence in 2 registers simultaneously. The operational permission that maintains your employment at £3 monthly. The provisional status that transforms every future transaction into evidence awaiting retrospective classification. Cruz moves toward the front door. Stops beside the Metropolitan Police notice still pinned to the door frame, the ink announcement that brought him here now, superseded by the notation in his leather case that determines what remains possible. Good afternoon, gentlemen. The shop bell announces his departure. Through the window you watch him turn south on Whitechapel Road, the leather case containing your 11 months of pharmaceutical practice carried in one hand, while the other adjusts his collar against October cold that has not changed temperature since Thursday dawn when this began. The door closes, the bell settles, Aldridge releases breath he has held since Cruz opened the stock records. Adequate oversight, he says, not to you. To the space where the inspector stood 30 seconds ago. Conservative dispensing practices. You pick up the ledger from the consultation table. Feel the leather binding warm from afternoon gaslight, the weight unchanged by the inspection that has changed what the weight documents. Every entry you made for 11 months sits in permanent ink awaiting verification that will either confirm professional competence or retrospectively designate the same actions as negligent dispensing requiring Metropolitan Police enforcement under Section 17 of an Act that makes no distinction between clinical judgment and criminal negligence. The brass measuring spoon rests in its drawer. The amber bottles sit on their shelves in descending size order. The pharmacy continues its mechanical function, while Inspector Cruz walks toward his office, carrying documentation that determines whether function remains legal. Aldridge returns the stock records to the cabinet beneath the workbench, locks it, tests the handle twice. Within the fortnight, you say. Yes. The afternoon customers will arrive in 30 minutes. Mrs. Whitmore at 3 o'clock for her usual cough remedy. The carter from Dorset Street at 3:30 for laudanum, measured to the grain. Sarah Pritchard will not return because her address appeared on Thursday's coroner list, but someone else will request the same remedy for an infant whose weight requires pharmaceutical calculation that transforms crying into silence. You open the ledger to today's date, pick up your pen. The page waits blank, ready for documentation that exists now in the provisional space between adequate oversight and additional verification required, between professional practice and evidence pending classification. The gaslight warms the mahogany counter, the narcotic sweetness thickens in afternoon air. The brass instruments rest clean in their drawer, ready for measuring doses that will be recorded in permanent ink that cannot prevent outcomes but succeeds in documenting everything. Verification continues. The pharmacy remains open. Both facts matter equally until Inspector Cruz returns within the fortnight to determine which fact matters more. The sun sets behind the warehouses at 4:30. The light through the shop window goes amber, then grey, then nothing. You light the lamps. Thomas Aldridge appears at 5:30 with the supply order from Burroughs Wellcome. 30 amber bottles, 2 pounds of glycerin, 1 gross of cork stoppers. He sets the crate beside the workbench without comment. The wood scrapes against stone. You unpack in silence. Each bottle finds its place on the shelf according to size. The rhythm requires no thought. Aldridge watches from the consultation table, his pipe smoke drifting through lamplight in patterns that dissolve before reaching the ceiling. Margaret Finch came by while you were at the wholesaler, you say. He looks up. For her mother, the usual. You recorded it? Yes. The ledger sits open on the counter. The entry reads, October 18th, 1878. M. Finch, proxy. Camphor liniment, 2 ounces, 1 shilling 4pence. The ink is dry. The transaction exists now in permanent record, waiting with all the others for Cruz to return and decide what waiting means. You finish unpacking. Aldridge taps his pipe against the table edge. The ash falls into the brass dish he keeps there for this purpose. The small sound fills the shop. How many days until he comes back? Aldridge asks. 13, maybe 12. And we continue, as before. It is not a question. You answer anyway. Yes. The shop bell rings. A woman enters carrying an infant against her shoulder. She does not give her name. You do not ask. She requests the mixture for teething pain, 2 drams, paid in coins still warm from her palm. You measure, you record, you accept payment. The transaction requires 4 minutes. When she leaves, Aldridge is standing at the window watching Whitechapel Road empty into evening. The gas lamps outside flicker on one by one, lit by the lamplighter who passes at the same hour every night, his ladder scraping cobblestones in a rhythm you could set a clock by. The 62 children on Hartley's list, Aldridge says. How many came through this shop? You have thought about this question for 4 days. You do not have an answer that feels true. I don't know. Guess. Maybe 15, maybe none. The coroner certificates don't specify where the laudanum was purchased. Aldridge turns from the window. His face in lamplight looks older than it did on Thursday morning before Cruz arrived. But you measured it, he says. You recorded it. You watched them carry it out the door. Yes. And now Cruz has the records. Yes. The lamp on the counter burns steady. The wick needs trimming, but you do not trim it. Outside, the street sounds fade. A cart passes. Voices drift from the public house on the corner. The city continues its evening without pause. Aldridge returns to the consultation table, sits, opens the stock records and runs his finger down the columns, not reading, just touching the ink. We measured correctly, he says. We did. We followed the formulations. We did. And some of them died anyway. The sentence sits between you. You do not contradict it. You do not confirm it. Both actions feel inadequate to what the sentence contains. The lamp flame wavers. You trim the wick. The light steadies. The pharmacy smells of camphor and glycerin, and the narcotic sweetness that never fully leaves the air. Your hands smell the same. You have scrubbed them twice since the woman left, and they still smell the same. Aldridge closes the stock records, stands, puts on his coat. Lock up when you're finished, he says. I will. He pauses at the door, turns. 13 days, he says. Yes. The bell rings. The door closes. His footsteps fade south on Whitechapel Road, toward the lodging house where he rents 2 rooms and sleeps alone and wakes to do this again. You remain at the counter. The ledger waits open. The lamps burn steady. The amber bottles sit in their rows, each one containing a remedy that works exactly as the formulation promises, no more and no less, the outcome depending entirely on variables you cannot control, and will be held accountable for anyway. You close the ledger, lock the cabinet, check the door latch twice. The routine holds, because routine is what remains when certainty fails. Outside, the gas lamps burn in their iron brackets. The street is empty now. Whitechapel settles into night. Somewhere in the city, Inspector Cruz sits at his desk, transcribing today's adequate oversight into tomorrow's additional documentation required, his pen moving in strokes that will determine whether this pharmacy remains open or becomes the 5th closure in his quarterly report. You turn down the lamps, lock the door, walk home through October cold that smells of coal smoke and river damp and the 1,000 small fires burning in rooms where mothers measure doses by lamplight and hope the crying stops, and sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, and the difference is measured in grains too small to see. The work continues, the documentation continues, both facts wait together for verification. Morning arrives through fog that softens the edges of Whitechapel Road. You unlock the pharmacy at 7. The brass key turns in the lock with the resistance it has always carried, the mechanism unchanged by everything that has changed around it. Inside, the air is cold. You light the lamps. The flame catches on the first match. Small competence. You hang your coat on the hook behind the counter, where it has hung for 3 years. The ledger sits where you left it last night. You open it to today's page, October 19th, 1878. The date waits at the top in your handwriting, entered yesterday in preparation for transactions that have not yet occurred but will. The routine holds. You depend on this. Aldridge arrives at 7:30, carries the Morning Post, 3 letters, 2 from suppliers, 1 from the Pharmaceutical Society, requesting updated membership dues. He sets them on the consultation table without reading them. 12 days now, he says. Yes. He moves to the workbench and begins the morning inspection, checks each amber bottle for proper seal, tests the brass scales for level accuracy, counts the measuring spoons. The ritual takes 15 minutes. You have watched him perform it every morning since you began work here. The precision never varies. The first customer arrives at 8 o'clock, a man you do not recognize requesting Dover's powder for dysentery. You measure 10 grains of opium, 10 grains of ipecac, mix with milk sugar to bulk. The formulation is standard. The transaction takes 6 minutes. You record it in the ledger. The man pays, leaves. The shop bell marks his exit. Do you remember his face? Aldridge asks. No. Neither do I. The morning proceeds. Mrs. Whitmore at 9, for her cough remedy. The carter from Dorset Street at 9:30 for his usual laudanum. A woman at 10, requesting something for her child's cough. You measure, you record, you accept payment. Each transaction adds 1 line to the ledger. 1 more piece of evidence waiting for Cruz to return and decide what evidence means. At 11 o'clock, the shop is empty. Aldridge sits at the consultation table reading the Pharmaceutical Society letter. You stand at the counter organizing the morning's receipts into the cash box. The coins smell of copper and handling. You count them twice. The arithmetic matches. The letter says they're updating the dispensing guidelines, Aldridge says. New restrictions on opiate preparations for children under 2 years. When? January 1st. 3 months away. After Cruz returns. After the verification determines whether this pharmacy still exists in January to implement new guidelines. You file the receipts, close the cash box, the lock clicks. Will it matter, you ask? Aldridge folds the letter, sets it aside. Probably not. The shop bell rings. You look up expecting a customer. Instead, a boy stands in the doorway holding a sealed envelope. He wears the uniform of a Metropolitan Police messenger. "Delivery for Aldridge Pharmacy," he says. Aldridge stands, takes the envelope. The boy leaves without waiting for reply. The bell rings again. The envelope is cream-colored paper, official weight. The seal bears the Metropolitan Police mark. Aldridge turns it over twice before opening it. Inside, a single sheet. He reads it. His face does not change. He hands it to you. Inspector M. Cruz will conduct follow-up verification on Monday, October 28, 1878, at 9 o'clock. Ensure all documentation from previous inspection remains available for review. Additional pharmaceutical records from January through June 1878 should be prepared for cross-reference against coroner documentation. You read it twice. The words do not change. 9 days, Aldridge says. Yes. And they want the first 6 months now. Yes. You set the letter on the consultation table. The paper lies flat against mahogany, cream against dark wood, the official seal catching lamplight. The request is specific. January through June. The months before you began tracking losses with the precision that satisfied Thursday's inspection. The months when the ledger recorded sales without the systematic notation of every discrepancy, every broken bottle, every dose measured and remeasured, until the weight satisfied professional standard, rather than documentary requirement. We kept records, you say. Not like this. No, not like this. The shop bell rings. A customer enters. You serve them. The transaction is routine. You record it. They leave. The bell rings again. Aldridge sits at the consultation table staring at the letter. "I'll bring the old ledgers tomorrow," he says. "We'll go through them, match what we can." "All right." "It won't be perfect." "No. But it will be adequate." The word sits between you. Jafar to Demeter, Illard Salmon adequate. Cruz used it Thursday. Adequate oversight. Conservative dispensing practices. The verdict that kept the pharmacy open pending additional documentation that would determine whether adequate remains adequate, when examined against 6 months of records that documented transactions, without documenting every variable that transforms transaction into tragedy. The afternoon proceeds. Customers arrive. You measure doses, you record sales. The ledger fills with ink. Each entry exists now in permanent form, waiting with all the others for Cruz to return on October 28th at 9 o'clock, and decide what permanence means. At 5 o'clock Aldridge locks the cabinet, puts on his coat, pauses at the door. 9 days, he says again. Yes. We'll manage it. Yes. The bell rings. He leaves. You remain at the counter finishing the day's accounting. The numbers match. The cash box balances. The pharmacy has conducted 18 transactions today, 18 entries in the ledger, 18 opportunities for retrospective classification. You close the ledger. Turn down the lamps. Lock the door. Walk home through fog that has not lifted. The moisture settling on your coat in droplets too small to feel individually, but heavy enough in accumulation to soak through wool by the time you reach your lodging. Inside you hang the wet coat, light your own lamp, sit at the small table by the window. Outside Whitechapel continues its evening, gas lamps burn in the fog. Voices drift from the street. Somewhere in the city, Inspector Cruz sits at his desk preparing the questions he will ask in 9 days, his pen moving across paper in strokes that determine whether adequate oversight remains adequate, when measured against outcomes no amount of oversight can prevent. You do not sleep well. You have not slept well since Thursday. The arithmetic runs through your head in the dark. 9 days, 6 months of records. 62 children on Hartley's coroner lists. The numbers do not resolve into certainty. They multiply into questions that have no answers you can write in a ledger. Morning will come, you will unlock the pharmacy, you will measure doses, you will record transactions. The work continues, because the work is what remains when certainty fails. But tonight, in the small room with the lamp burning low, you sit at the window and watch fog obscure the street below, each gas lamp reduced to a dim glow that marks where light should be but cannot quite penetrate the thickness between intention and outcome. The calculation is simple: 9 days until verification, 6 months of records to prepare, 18 transactions today. The numbers are precise. What they mean will be decided by a man carrying a leather case containing 62 death certificates, and the institutional authority to transform professional judgment into criminal negligence with a stroke of his pen. You turn down the lamp, the room goes dark, outside the fog continues. Somewhere, mothers measure doses by lamplight, somewhere, infants cry or don't cry. Somewhere, the outcomes accumulate into statistics that will be examined and classified, and used as evidence for conclusions that feel both inevitable and impossible to accept. The work continues. The verification continues. Both facts exist together in the 9 days that remain before Inspector Cruz returns, to determine which fact matters more. Dr. Hartley arrives at 4 o'clock with his leather folder. The same Thursday timing maintained for 48 consecutive weeks. He places the coroner list on the counter with the same courteous nod, the ritual continuing as if the inspection 3 days ago never occurred. 6 names this week. You recognize 3 addresses before Thomas Aldridge takes the paper to perform his cross-reference in the back room. The gaslight casts amber patterns across the mahogany counter as evening approaches through the shop windows. Customers arrive in their usual sequence. The laundress from Commercial Street requesting 2 ounces of cough mixture. The dock worker's wife collecting her Thursday bottle. The wet nurse who no longer nurses requesting her usual quantity for teething pain. Sarah Pritchard enters at 4:30. You measure 8 ounces while the amber liquid catches the fading light through the window glass. The brass spoon moves with the precision of 3 years. Practice. You record her address, and the date in the ledger that survived Inspector Cruz's examination. The transaction completes in the space between what the documentation states, and what the Thursday lists confirm week after week. She counts the coins onto the counter. Her hands show no tremor. Neither do yours. The exchange requires no words beyond the quantity requested, and the price confirmed. She departs north on Whitechapel Road, and you return the bottle to its alphabetical position on the shelf behind the counter. Thomas Aldridge emerges from the back room at 5 o'clock. His hands no longer shake when holding the ledger. The inspection passed. The pharmacy remains open. The Thursday cross-reference continues its weekly accumulation of addresses that appear in both the sales records and the coroner lists, the pattern documented with pharmaceutical precision that makes no claim about what the pattern means. You arrange the remaining bottles in their proper sequence. The scent of laudanum and camphor fills the closed air. Outside, the October evening settles over Whitechapel, with the same indifference it shows every Thursday. The gaslight burns steady. The counter holds its familiar weight under your palms. The distinction between surviving the inspection and deserving to survive it dissolves in the simple fact of the pharmacy door remaining unlocked for tomorrow's customers. The last customer departs as gaslight dims to its evening register. You begin the closing ritual, wiping down the mahogany counter, arranging bottles in alphabetical order, checking the brass scale's rest level in their case. The narcotic sweetness accumulated through 12 hours of dispensing hangs thick in the still air, coating throat and lungs with each breath. Thomas Aldridge sits at the consultation table with Thursday's coroner list, and the sales ledger open side by side. His hand moves steady now across the pages, matching addresses with the mechanical precision that survived inspection. The pattern continues. 6 names this week. 3 addresses you recognize. The documentation accumulates in permanent ink while the amber bottles sit arranged behind the counter in perfect order. Your hands move through the evening tasks without conscious direction. Polish the brass measuring spoon. Return it to its velvet-lined case. Close the ledger with its soft leather sound. Place it on the shelf beside 11 months of previous volumes, each containing the same weekly pattern of Thursday cross-references and daily transactions. The distinction between what the ledgers document and what they mean becomes harder to identify as the gaslight dims. Both exist. Both matter. The space between them fills with the narcotic sweetness that has become indistinguishable from the act of breathing itself. Outside, Whitechapel settles into its evening sounds. Distant cartwheels on cobblestones. Voices from the public house 3 doors down. The fog beginning its slow accumulation in the October air. Inside, the pharmacy holds its familiar dimensions. The counter. The shelves. The amber bottles arranged in their proper sequence. The weight of brass instruments in your palms. The scent of laudanum and turpentine and camphor blending into the single fragrance that means work continues tomorrow. Thomas Aldridge closes both volumes. The coroner list goes into its folder for filing. The ledger returns to its shelf. He extinguishes the backroom lamp, then the consultation table lamp, leaving only the counter gaslight burning its final hour. You wipe down the counter one more time. The wood grain holds 3 years of similar evenings, polished smooth by repeated attention. The warmth of the day's work settles into your shoulders. The distinction between measuring doses and recording measurements dissolves in the amber light. Both serve the same function now. Both create the appearance of precision in a system where precision measures everything except what matters. The brass measuring spoon rests cool in your palm one final time tonight. You polish it with the soft cloth kept for this purpose, feeling the metal's smoothness under your fingertips. 3 years of daily use has worn no visible mark into the brass, though your hands know its weight and balance without looking. The velvet-lined case accepts the spoon with its familiar soft sound. You close the lid. Tomorrow morning you will open it again for the first customer requesting their usual quantity. The cycle continues with the mechanical certainty that survived Thursday's inspection, and will survive next week's coroner list. Your hands rest on the mahogany counter, feeling the worn surface polished flat by 3 years of similar evenings. The ledger sits closed on its shelf. The amber bottles stand arranged in perfect alphabetical order. The gaslight burns low, casting long shadows across familiar objects that need no light to locate. The weight of brass instruments settles into your palms like tools whose purpose has become indistinguishable from their use. Measuring doses, recording quantities, creating documentation that transforms pharmaceutical transactions into evidence that survived inspection, because the numbers matched within acceptable margins of institutional tolerance. Outside, fog thickens in the October air. Inside, the narcotic sweetness coats your lungs with each breath, heavy and sweet and inevitable as the sleep that comes after closing. You wipe the mahogany counter one last time. The cloth moves in slow circles across wood grain holding 3 years of pharmaceutical routine. The narcotic sweetness rises from the surface like fog, thick enough now to taste on your tongue. The amber bottles sit arranged in perfect order. Each contains measured doses of the tincture that fills the air you breathe. The boundary between interior and exterior dissolves as the scent coats lungs and throat. The brass spoon rests clean in its velvet case. The ledger sits closed. The gaslight dims to its final glow before darkness. The weight of careful measurements settles into your chest like fog settling over Whitechapel, heavy and sweet and thick. The distinction between precision and harm dissolves in the same motion as sleeping. The pharmacy holds its silence. Tomorrow continues. Tonight rests.